And welcome back. So following my review of the amazing novel, Christie Malry's Own Double Entry by B.S. Johnson, I'm very happy today to be interviewing Joseph Darlington, who is a British writer and academic specialized in the very subject of B.S. Johnson and experimental novels of the 1960s and 70s. He's the author of various relevant books to this subject, such as The Experimentalists, where he writes about experimental authors in Britain in the 1960s, such as B.S. Johnson and Anthony Burgess, as well as being the author of British terrorist novels of the 1970s, and finally, the editor of 3 volumes of the journals of B.S. Johnson, the author of Christie Malry's Own Double Entry. So, Joseph Darlington, thank you so much for joining us today. Where are you joining us from?
I'm in the Peak District, just south of Manchester in England currently. So
fantastic. Sounds like a lovely place. So I've just finished the novel we're discussing today, Christie Malry's Own Double Entry, and I was just blown away by this work. I wasn't very familiar with it before starting, and I just thought it was a fantastic novel, full of humor, but also quite disturbing evolutions with regard to the individual and society. And I guess the first question I have for you is, should Christie Malry be considered as a hero or an anti-hero? I mean, he's committing all these horrific crimes against society. At one point, he kills tens of thousands of people, and yet he remains fairly sympathetic to the reader. You are rooting for him as a reader, despite his increasingly horrific acts. What's your point of view on Christie Malry's heroism or anti-heroism?
Well, it's a very good question, and I'm very glad that you like the book as much as I did, because I love this book. I've read it about 10 or 13 times.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, for numerous projects as well as just for fun. It's a nice short one, so that helps.
Yep.
In terms of Christie himself, I think one of the benefits of the novel is because he's so clearly a construction of the author. All the way through, we're being kind of told by Johnson, or at least this figure who sounds like he's Johnson, that Christie is a simple person. He's been invented for the purposes of this novel, and the 10,000 people that he kills. When in the same mouthful that we hear that this is roughly the number of words that are in the novel at this point. All the way through, the violence is kind of couched in such a way that it doesn't feel particularly real. And I think that's why he comes across as a likable character, because he is, he's a simple person. He's the everyman, but he's a sort of simplified everyman. He's kind of, I don't know, almost a lovable idiot in a way, I suppose, which makes him sort of innocent, even though he does so much damage and violence. I think that's one of the strangest, most unique things about this novel.
Absolutely. So you hit on a very interesting subject right out of the gate, which is the construction of the novel in this sort of metafictional aspect of it, where the author is constantly inserting himself into the novel, where the characters are discussing whether this is something that's of interest to the reader or not. And it's all very humorous. So where does that? I'm wondering what was B.S. Johnson's intent in injecting so much humor in a subject which ultimately is quite serious. I mean, the fundamental theme here, I think, is the relationship of the individual to society and to state. And yet it's treated in this sort of quite funny, humoristic way. In my review on Instagram, I sort of described it as Fight Club written by Monty Python. And there is that sort of bonkers humor to it. So what's how do those two combine? Why did B.S. Johnson have this idea of combining this very serious subject with such humor?
Well, I think the question of the kind of meta-fictional stuff goes back to, this is something that Johnson does throughout his career. He has this mantra that telling stories is telling lies, and he only ever wants to write the truth. But as he goes through his career, he increasingly kind of weakens this line between truth and reality. It's his second book, but it's the only first one that's available, because his first one he sort of disowned earlier in his career. His second book Albert Angelo, he has this big moment where he breaks through at the end and says, "Fuck all this lying." And I have to believe that bit. But he says, "I'm not going to write about writing anymore. I'm not going to write about this story anymore. I'm going to write about writing."
Mhm.
And he had this big rant in the first person, which is very clearly Johnson's voice breaking through. Christie Malry is about 10 years after that book. And so by this point, he's written lots in that style. And I think it's become his kind of patented style of writing, is that he always writes in such a way that he's very clearly showing you a construction. And I feel like his very real sense of anger at the state of the world, combined with a sense of kind of fatalistic despair that made all political action seem kind of ridiculous, comes together in this quite unique, I suppose, manner, which is where he is always attempting to say something brutally honest, but at the same time catches himself saying ridiculous things. And he can never, in his attempt to be honest, I think he's always intentionally undermining himself. I don't know. He's a very strange character. So I'm never great at sort of second guessing.
Right. So you mentioned the P word in your answer, which is of course political, and so I'm wondering if you can give us an overview of the landscape in which this novel and other novels that you might be referring to in your book, British terrorist novels of the 1970s. What is the landscape here that gave rise to this sort of literature, those sort of characters with those sort of violent intents?
Well, I guess the broader trajectory is that you have a very revolutionary moment at the end of the 60s, which is quite hopeful, that then turns sour into the start of the 70s. And during the mid to late 70s, you get a big rise of terrorism, particularly of this kind called the urban guerrilla. That happens across Europe. In Britain, it is the least violent. They have one group called the Angry Brigade, who are actually a bit incompetent, and their bombs, they'll shatter a few windows, but they didn't do much, in the way of hurting people, like physically. So as a result, you get this strange obsession at the time by many writers writing about terrorism in light-hearted ways, which often isn't to sympathize with the terrorists, but it's to make them look like figures of fun and a bit ridiculous.
Was there a view at the time with these writers that other European groups like the Red Brigades in Italy or Baader Meinhof in Germany, that they were more glamorous and more effective in creating social change, or was there a sort of quite typical British distance from this sort of mad European terrorism?
Well, yeah, I think that's definitely I think there is definitely a sense that this is something that only the Europeans could take seriously. The British have quite a lot of sense of humor about themselves, and there's something about the slight silliness of a radical pose that's that extreme, that you're willing to bomb people over what appear to be fairly minor political issues. For example, the Angry Brigade bombed a BBC van over the Miss World pageant, which, the Miss World pageant was quite a sexist thing at the time, but blowing up a van appeared to be an overreaction to that to a lot of people. And so they had a sort of, I guess, a Monty Python-esque quality to them, where everything they did seemed to go wrong. They didn't seem to do too much damage. And you could compare that with groups like in Italy and in Germany, which were causing genuine destruction. And at the same time, you've got a civil war essentially occurring in Belfast and Northern Ireland, which is terribly destructive. And so the Angry Brigade, by contrast certainly to that, appear, as figures of fun, really.
So that's how that would feed the humorous dimension of authors like B.S. Johnson. They would have seen this whole terrorist thing as being a bit of a joke, a bit of a lark.
Yes, although Johnson, in his typically contradictory way, also seems at times to have a real sort of depth of sympathy for them. He and Alan Burns, who's a sort of friend and at times co-writer with him, they go and visit the Angry Brigade trial, which was, I think, is still the longest criminal trial in British history. It goes on for about 6 months, and they went and attended in the gallery and took notes and sort of followed along with it. Alan Burns also writes a book that's called The Angry Brigade in 1973 that he's writing at the same time as Christie Malry. And I think they had a sort of sympathy for the sort of, I don't know, ineffectiveness, the smallness of these people, and the largeness of the size of what they wanted to do. They wanted to bring about an entire revolution on their own, and were clearly not fitted for the purpose. And there's that kind of, I guess, pathos which drives Christie Malry. I suppose that's why Christie is such a sympathetic figure as well, in his kind of weakness and simplicity.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Is there something punk in this, or something that can be linked to the origins of punk? Is there a connection between Christie Malry and the Sex Pistols?
That's a good question. Whether Christie Malry was read by punks, I expect it was. There's a British comedy writer called David Quantick, who was a punk, who's written for the B.S. Johnson Journal. So I know at least one punk really likes this book. But it came out about 3 years before punk, and Johnson died before punk became a phenomenon. I know that he did sue the Daily Mail when they called him a hippie. So if he'd lasted long enough to see punk, I suppose he probably would have been a bit too grumpy to have actually enjoyed it himself. But there's certainly the same energy, a kind of aggressive, anti-establishment energy to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So now on a very specific point in the book, again, coming to the sort of more ideological side of things, in the book, Christie Malry writes maybe not a manifesto, but more of a method to which he swears he's going to adhere. And part of that method is he's going to be a cell of one. He's not going to be part of a group. He's going to operate on his own and exact the retribution that he believes is his accounting due as a single individual. Weirdly, that seems a bit antithetical to ideas of the terrorist groups at the time, who were maybe more anarchist leaning and more leaning towards collective action and so on. So where does this individualism fit in, and what does it say about, B.S. Johnson and his view of society?
It's a very good question, and it's one of perhaps the most intriguing bits of the book, is that he certainly doesn't espouse any of the same kinds of political philosophies that you do hear from these groups. I guess partly it's that the real life Angry Brigade and the real life kind of countercultural terrorists are existing in this very individualistic space. It's the same space as like the drug underground, rock music. It's expressing yourself, being yourself. It's all of that hippie stuff just turned aggressive. So in a way, he's caught the crux of the actuality of these people, which is that they were very individualistically minded. They wouldn't have fit into a socialist society if they'd managed to bring one about. But I think it also ties to the underlying sort of tension with him as a writer and the role of the creative, because creative people, I think, as we can see today, are always kind of wondering, is it okay to be this individualistic, especially if you want to change the world, and so much of the discourse around changing the world is about collective action. The writer is always a kind of lone individual, and so I have a feeling that he's also playing out some of his own. As someone who was a militant trade unionist and really supported kind of collective action on that level, the fact that his personal work was entirely kind of his own individual vision, I think it's some of those contradictions, or at least interesting kind of aspects, that he's trying to play out in the figure of Christie.
Because there's something definitely almost libertarian about it, and it's really the individual needs to have their freedom to react to society in whichever way the individual sees fit, and so to me that was quite unusual. For example, earlier I mentioned Fight Club, which of course stems from a similar place of disgust with contemporary society and so on, but very gradually evolved into an army of disgruntled people. So I thought that was an interesting contrast to that piece of work. In terms of some of the characters in the book, and the book is full of quite colorful characters, namely the girlfriend, who is given this weird name, the Shrike, that sort of seems to be a mix of the shrew and the strike, or I don't know where that comes from, and maybe you can tell us more about that, as well as the colleague Headlam, who's nicknamed Bedlam, And so can you tell us a little bit about those characters? I mean, what do you think they're supposed to symbolize, if anything, or are they just to be taken at face value, perhaps, as passersby in Christie's story?
Yeah, I think they sort of have this strange half existence that Christie also has, where we're not sure if we're supposed to treat them as real people or not. But inevitably we do. I think this is one of the lessons of Christie Malry, is that as much as he's telling you, I've just invented these people, they're fake, they're not real, you still invest them with all this stuff because they do have characters. In terms of the Shrike, there's a real sense of her kind of being there as his love interest in a way. I think there's even a reference to Lawrence Sterne's Tristram Shandy, where the widow Wadman is being described, and Lawrence Sterne says, in fact, I can't do justice to her, so here's an empty page, draw whatever you want, and that'll be what she looks like. And so that's taken by Johnson. He's a massive fan of Sterne and put into the figure of the Shrike. Now, in terms of the name of the Shrike, that's interesting because I looked it up and it appears to be reference to a bird that would catch living animals and would stick them onto sharp objects and leave them kind of wriggling there, and it would come back later to eat them. There's a line in the book which is kind of, this is either going to be too obvious to some readers or it's going to be not obvious enough to other readers. And I have to say that as someone who's written largely on this book and read it many times, it remains too opaque for me. I still haven't not quite any idea what he meant by naming the character after that.
Because I mean, when I first encountered the character in the book with such a name, and now that you mentioned this quite aggressive bird, I was imagining a quite unpleasant, nasty, maybe even violent character, and it turns out she's actually quite a sweet girl who seems quite in love with Christie Malry and quite happy to be with him, and happy to cut short the visits to her mother in order to spend more time with them. A brilliant line, which we won't repeat here. But I was just very surprised by that character. So that was brilliant. Let's talk a little bit about connections of this work to other works. You've just mentioned that B.S. Johnson was a huge fan of Lawrence Sterne and Tristram Shandy, which I didn't know. Thank you so much for pointing that out. It makes a lot of sense. In terms of a more obvious connection to a book like A Clockwork Orange, which was written roughly 10 years before, there are a lot of links there, and I'm wondering what the links might have been between Anthony Burgess and B.S. Johnson, which you might have written in your book, The Experimentalists, or how do they connect? How do they agree or disagree with each other?
Well, they knew each other fairly well. They moved in the same circles, and Johnson's first novel was reviewed by Anthony Burgess fairly positively. Burgess sort of gives him a sort of backhanded kind of, he's got a great kind of set of instruments, but he needs to put them to better kind of purpose, which nowadays would be a very bad review, but reviews were pretty vicious in the 60s, so that was a positive one, and everyone else laid into it. They often had conversations. They worked on a few things. Well, one thing together specifically, London Consequences, which was a novel where you passed on you wrote a chapter and you passed it on to another writer. But as much as Johnson seemed to like Burgess, I think later on sort of goes off him a bit. Johnson had a habit of ranting and all his theories about literature and how it ought to be and how it definitely shouldn't be. Whereas Burgess, I think, was a bit more easygoing and thought that writers could write what they wanted to. At one point, I think he is quoted as saying, what's it? I think he's at a party and Johnson is talking about novels, and someone asks if Burgess would like to weigh in, and Burgess says, no, I don't talk to Brian about novels.
I don't talk to what, sorry?
I don't talk to Brian about novels.
Oh, gosh. All right.
Brian, B. Johnson's for Brian. Yeah, so there was clearly Johnson liked Burgess. I imagine Burgess had a certain sympathy with Johnson, but by this point, Burgess had left the country. He was living in the south of France. No, he was living in Malta.
Oh, Malta.
It was just before Italy. He was living in Malta. In fact, he might have been to Italy. But in Malta, he couldn't get any books because of censorship. Most of these books that came out in the 60s in Britain were a bit lurid and they couldn't get past the censors over there. And so he stops reviewing books. So it's unlikely that Burgess read anything by any British writer after the time he goes there. And his own books become notably less experimental after The Clockwork Orange as well.
Right. Yeah. So what, in terms of the influence then of this book on literature and general popular culture, I mean, what impact do you think it's had? Do you notice any visibility of it in today's world, or do you think it's, because it's not very well known, it's relatively cult, let's say, and so I'm wondering if in any other way it's impacted literature or authors or other artists in any meaningful way.
Yeah, it's a very good question because it is one of these cult books, and so I know there's a Welsh band that are named after it.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was working as an editor on the Johnson Journal, there were a couple of people interested in staging it, but I don't think that occurred. There was a movie version, which I admit I've not seen. Have you seen that one?
I have seen the movie, and it's actually very good. I saw it 20 years ago, and that's why 20 years later I remembered, wait, that movie was really good, and but it's nowhere near as good as the book, as usual.
Right. Yeah, because I want to watch it. I need to track it down somewhere because it's not very readily available. Like the book. Thankfully, books are easy to get now because of the internet. But I think that type of writing as well, experimental writing from in the 60s vein, which was usually quite earnest and quite kind of politically driven to sort of change things, becomes very, very unpopular in Britain in the 80s and the 90s, where there's sort of experimentalism shifts, it becomes a bit more cynical, it becomes a bit more postmodern. And I think that earlier type is sort of, it's looked down on by the people writing experimentally, and it's also looked down upon by the mainstream. So I think it's only really in this this side of the millennium where it starts coming back. There was a very influential Johnson biography in 2004 by Jonathan Coe called Like a Fiery Elephant. And that reignited a huge boom of interest. That's when I started reading Johnson in a big way. And so I think you start seeing the influence a lot more in contemporary writers, like people like Isabel Weidner seems to have some kind of Johnson influence. There's Jonathan Coe, who wrote the biography, although he doesn't necessarily write in an experimental fashion. He does have books like The Rotters Club, which appear to have a kind of Christie Malry influence to them. And so I think there's a sort of hidden influence there. As I say, David Quantick, the comedy writer who's worked with Chris Morris on stuff like Brass Eye and quite cult comedy shows from Britain, he is a huge fan of the book as well. So I think that there's probably a buried history of people influenced by it, but in terms of direct things, there's nothing.
It's more pervasive and underground, is it?
Underground, suitably, I think.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, well, that's, I think, all that we have time for today. Joseph, thank you so much for joining us and answering our questions. Really a pleasure to hear more about this fantastic book, which I really strongly recommend. Any viewers who are interested can check out my short review on my Instagram account. And thank you so much again, Joseph, and have a great day. Thank you.